to From Know to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Something that we as a society seem to struggle to say these days is, I don't know. We live in a world where people like to believe they're right, and they usually want you to know it as well. Here on the show, we've been accused of swinging too far in the other direction, since we don't know might as well be our catchphrase. Today we're going to talk about the ultimate position of not knowing, agnosticism.
Have we been accused of this?
Yeah. We've had a couple of people, well, they don't really, you never answer anything. Well,
no. We did do the disclaimer,
I mean, it's in the name of the show. We talk about it's from nowhere to nothing. We're not here trying to solve all the problems. So where does the philosophical story of agnosticism, let's say, what is agnosticism?
Agnosticism is not knowing. It's literally what the word means, and it can be traced back conceptually to the earliest philosophical discussions, but it actually was coined as a formal term by T.H. Huxley, who was a major figure in much culture, Western culture in the 19th century, and he was a supporter of Darwinism, so on and so forth. But the idea that because in the sciencey time of the 19th century, when people were essentially saying we got to move beyond all of this religion stuff, it was important to find ground for him, and many people to try to have that open space where you can say, I don't know. Basically, agnosticism, while it's applied to generally, I don't know, or not knowing, it's most often applied in religious connotations or circumstances. So it basically means there's no evidence that God exists, but you can't prove that God or gods don't exist. And so it's better to just leave it alone and get on with your conversations in your life with things that you can tangibly prove or disprove.
Okay, yeah, you said something interesting in there, and I'm curious about it. So agnosticism is usually used in regard to religion. Is that its only use, or can you use it in other?
Oh, it is used
in
other circumstances. Yes, if you say in some academic circles, particularly if you say I'm agnostic, it's just you're saying I'm agnostic about this. It means I don't know.
I think that's a really important part of academic discussions.
In the open, in general street terms, probably most people don't. A lot of people wouldn't even know probably what the term means anymore. But if they do, that's usually the hot button theological topic. And so,
yeah, and that's interesting because, I'm halfway through a doctoral program and I haven't heard the word agnostic used in a scholarly setting. So in all the research articles that I've read, I've never encountered the word. And that reminds me of an interesting aspect of the course that I just finished. They made a point where they said, really, data on its own doesn't tell you a story. They said it's the theory that underlies the perspective is what tells the story. So they said it's very easy for a study to be performed, and even if it's a randomized control trial, the gold standard of experimentation that is supposed to get at the root of causality of something. Two scientists who have different theoretical bases can look at the same data and interpret it in different ways and come to different conclusions. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's what you see happen a lot in academia is that very thing. Rather than scientists speaking candidly, like the author of my textbook did, and saying, okay, well, data is great. Data's, data is the facts, but how you interpret the facts can determine what is actually being said. And of course, he highlights stories of bad scientists who do go beyond that and actually are trying to tell a story that's not there, right? Because scientists are also humans that either make mistakes or have agendas. So there's an important weeding process going on there. But I think that in terms of the discussion of agnosticism, I would like to see that word used a lot more in the academic literature. Science saying, okay, well, maybe here's what we think it's saying, but we don't know. Some more of the we don't know. But I think there might be a hang up there with some of these people that reach such a level in a field that they have a hard time acknowledging.
That's probably part of it. I mean, Huxley came to it finally because he was, well, in England, there's a thing called the Metaphysical Society. I mean, I think people belong to it around the planet, but that's where it was founded. And he joined, and he was encountering colleagues who were, and there are articles about this that talk about they were advocating things like theism and metaphysics and materialism and pantheism and all these idealism, and he said he coined the word to suggest that there could be a position antithetical to those who, quote, professed to know so much about the very things of which I was ignorant. So he was carving himself a space to say, I don't know.
Yeah. And that's awesome because, that the time that he coined that term was very interesting, highlighted by the conference where he, proposed it, which was like the Metaphysical Society or something like that. Right. How cool would it be if we had a metaphysical society?
And it exists. I don't know if you have to be tapped to be invited or whatever. We can form our own. But also there are writers philosophers who point out in writing about this that the difference between agnosticism and theism, for instance, is that agnosticism is not an ideology, it's a method. Because not knowing implies the possibility of making attempts to know phenomenologically. It doesn't require you to, but it also is a method because you're not just planting a flag. You're saying, okay, so if I were to try to know, how would I try to know? And if I weren't to try to know, that's okay.
Yeah. And that's everything that you just said is going to be really important to the whole discussion today. It leads me into the next question, which is there a consensus on what agnosticism is, or are there different flavors of it?
There are different flavors of it. And I think even when you were one of my students back when, did I have you reading somebody named A.C. Grayling?
I don't know if I got that book in any of my classes.
Probably not there yet, because I learned of a major modern philosopher named A.C. Grayling, a British philosopher. Learned much from him, and he put out a book that was for lay people, for people wanting to learn about basic kinds of things, and so many books. But this was called Ideas That Matter. And once I found that book, I was many students over many, many years having them read it. And he does a 2-page definitional essay about many, many things, sometimes 2 or 3 pages. And agnosticism is one of those. And Grayling holds essentially that he doesn't say Huxley was a wimp, but but he's saying agnosticism, from his viewpoint, is just giving into a sort of mushiness when you really should just be atheistic and get on with it. Because to say, for Grayling, and I like the case that he makes too, but to say that, well, I can't prove this, I can't disprove this, it leaves an opening for the possibility, and for folks like Grayling, the possibility doesn't exist, that God exists. And he has all kinds of interesting arguments for that. But he says agnosticism leads to the kind of thing where we have the tooth fairy and Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and God and just puts them all together as these constructs that we make to make ourselves feel better. But of course, we know we're making the construct. So there's that flavor, that arch flavor, I guess.
Yeah. So when I was doing the research, it sounds like they basically split it into two camps: hard agnosticism and soft agnosticism.
Oh, there's a third one: theistic agnosticism, which is to say, well, since I don't know if God exists or doesn't exist, that allows me to practice a kind of theism where I'll be involved with the religion at a distance or in some way, because after all, it's going to do no harm. And that sort of arises out of the 1600s with scientist Blaise Pascal, with a thing called Pascal's wager, which I think we've talked about in passing at some time.
Yeah. Which
is essentially if it's possible, even a skinchy little possibility that God exists, and most of the evidence that there's no evidence to say that God exists, well, it might, if you go ahead and say, well, I'll believe in God and I'll do this because there's a reward at the end of all of it, you'd be better off doing that than if God doesn't exist, well, you're not going to miss it anyway when you die. So,
right.
So that's that kind of flavor of agnosticism.
Yeah. Okay. So, theistic agnosticism is Pascal's wager. Hard agnosticism is the position you were just describing.
Grayling, yeah.
A.C. Grayling, I think Richard Dawkins I saw when I was looking through
Daniel Dennett, yeah.
Yeah, some of these guys that are probably in the tradition. There's sort of the, Huxley is sort of their what's the word I'm looking for? Their influence throughout. They're approaching from a scientific position, and then so that's this idea that basically you can never know, and full stop. Soft agnosticism is that position that we don't know if God exists, but maybe in the future there will be some way. Maybe we'll have some sort of scientific advancements that will allow us to find something. Maybe like in the Old Testament, God will just start showing up and, talking with people and stuff, who knows? But the point is, I think soft agnosticism is we don't know, and hard agnosticism is we can't know.
And Huxley, it sort of traipses in there, in that zone. He believes in principle. And so for Huxley to put this out there, he's essentially saying that it's wrong to claim certainty for anything, for certainty, for the truth of a proposition, unless you can provide evidence that justifies it. So he's not going the ultra hard route, which leads into atheism, is to say there can never be any proof, as you just said. He's saying, well, until you can find proof, it's sort of like Scully in the X-Files. You're not going to sway me from the principle that nothing proves this.
Yeah. So logically, what are the benefits to being a hard agnosticist versus a soft agnosticist, right? Because I'm thinking to myself, right, from a philosophical position, logically, why would I exclude the possibility of knowing? Because, all right, so scientifically, I can sort of, well, even then, right? What is it if there is a God, what is to stop him from doing something at any given point that lets us know that he's actually here in an empirical way? Mm-hmm. To me, it doesn't seem like there's a logical reason to rule such a thing out.
Well, that's what I think Huxley was essentially getting at, is that from his viewpoint, as opposed to there were harder versions of this to declaim that there's absolutely no possibility because there has been no evidence whatsoever, because sacred text is just text. It's stories. Well, we have stories of everything from Hercules to, so it goes that route. So logically, if you do a kind of hard logic, no propositions, no premises can be offered that would lead to proof. So that's why. So you can get all mushy, but really, the hard logicians say no. We see. We're finding things out all the time. For instance, now with the James Webb and about the age of the universe and so on. But that's evidentiary material that says, okay, no, we have to revise. This inductive conclusion needs to be revised again. But there's nothing of phenomenological data point in that zone. There's nothing that can lead to that. But that's a pretty harsh.
Yeah, because you see here again. Remember how? So at the beginning I was talking about how an experiment, the exact same experiment, two theoreticians starting at different positions could draw different conclusions from the same data set, right?
Right.
I think this is a sort of a similar thing, but with logic, right? I 100% agree with you. Whereas if you're looking at the issue from a scientific or, a logically inductive point, there's nothing to support it, right? We have laws of physics that work perfectly well to describe how things happened. And there hasn't been anything that has violated them in the 13.8 billion years that we can observe.
Right.
And when there are violations, it usually causes a minor revision, not something that completely rewrites the entire books. So logically, it would seem, okay, we have a pretty clear picture of what's going on. But from a different theoretical viewpoint, right? And there was an interesting article this week in one of the philosophy journals that I follow online where they said, and actually Sabine Hassenfelder references this in the book that we read. Yeah. It says, listen,
physics.
The Big Bang Theory, it works. And in the article this week, they were saying, there's all this hubbub everywhere about the James Webb Telescope invalidating the Big Bang Theory. It hasn't done that. As a matter of fact, it's done the opposite. It's established that the model works very well. But the model only works, the model doesn't tell you where the universe came from. It just tells you how the universe has progressed since it came into being. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say anything about how it came into being. And by definition, we must take a hard agnostic position on that point of it, right? We cannot know scientifically where it came from. So but that conclusion from one theoretical perspective would seem to indicate to a certain group of people, right, that because of that, you can't rule out God or anything else from being that.
I think that
the prime mover, right? What we've talked about before.
Right, exactly. And I think that this takes us to the crux of I'm not, it's not a culture wars thing because everything's been made into culture wars now. It's like Marvel's Secret Wars, on and on it goes. But there is a space and I think that many scientists go there, in which they're not rejecting all of the possibilities, but they are saying that, but there's a difference between being open-minded and humble in the face of the universe and what you're learning constantly, or having to adhere. So I think this is where it goes toward a critique of evangelical biblical literalism, having to adhere to the book. So Carl Sagan, for instance, says, who's more humble? The scientist who looks at the universe with an open mind and accepts whatever the universe has to teach us, which means we say we're wrong or we're wrong again, but this one we're right about for now. Or somebody who says everything in this book must be considered the literal truth and never mind the fallibility of all the human beings involved in the creation of the book. So I think that that's really the space in which do you take everything in a sacred text literally, or do you have the openness to say, if you claim that this is poetry, and some of it is, if you claim that it's history, well, Herodotus was writing history too, and it had griffins in it. If you have a pliant place in which to say, well, not everything is literal, then I think that's where it opens up to the agnostic possibilities.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of scenario, right? Because we often talk about how usually if you look at a sliding scale, people like to place religion on one end and science on the other end. And that's sort of a false dichotomy, right? There are scientists who are religious and whatnot. But I think that in some ways, right, maybe you replace religion and science with rationalism and empiricism, right? Or something along those lines. Agnosticism would seem to be that center point where you get to a spot and you go, okay, well, I don't know, right? You're sort of getting to one place from either end. And I think that that's the interesting part, is trying to define where that middle ground is. And I think this soft versus hard agnosticism is a very interesting sort of delineation, because I think that it's a sort of a different viewpoint on where the center is, right? If you have somebody, you have people who are empiricists or more towards a scientific leaning, they're more inclined to say, okay, this is the way things have been, this is the way things are. There's nothing that leads us to believe that something different would take place. Ergo, we cannot know. Whereas somebody else might say, okay, well, this is the way things are, but what we think we know is always changing. We can't know, but maybe we will know, So it's an interesting
This takes us back to, we go back etymologically again. In the ancient world, gnosis was knowing, but it was knowing. This had another topic we've talked about, this had the mystical focus. So gnosis was often applied to, and arises from, esoteric mystical knowledge. Think Doctor Strange, right? And again, and not mocking. I'm just trying to use things that we have common at hand in our pop culture. Things that you can learn from books, but but once learned, essentially need to be applied. Well, suppose you learn them, but you don't learn them well enough, you can't apply them. It could be said that that's being agnostic. Gnosis, being the negative. There isn't a fusion with the Gnostic knowledge. Okay, that's in the ancient world. What you're just describing so well is when you come up into our own time, we have we know things, or we have access to knowing. We have knowledge that is available in the form of facts, that the facts accrue. All facts don't change, but new facts can adjust what was previously known. In my lifetime, I mean, when I was a tiny little kid, generally science was saying that there's one galaxy.
Yeah.
And here I sit, thinking all of the things that I have access to, that we have come to know, and it cannot help but change my thinking about the vastness of the infinitude of the universe and the fascination of it. I don't need religion complement that or to highlight that. But I'm not bashing people for whom that complementarity of a relationship between science and religion works, as long as there is a complementarity of relationship. Where I see things go enormously south is when knowledge is rejected in favor of a belief that doesn't have a science basis for it. And that leads us all down a path, or can lead us all down a path that is basically wrong for human development. So
yeah,
that's me. I'm speaking for myself on this.
Yeah, I think that's the important phrase there, is when knowledge is rejected in favor of belief. And I think that's the part that is interesting to me, is because I believe that can go either way, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I think that the one case is very clear. I think that everybody's familiar with it, which is religious people who reject scientific knowledge in favor of religious belief.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it is possible for it to work the other way, which is that scientists, based off of an empirical body of evidence, right, can reject the knowledge, which this is hard to say because it's the knowledge that you don't know. So you reject the position of agnosticism in the belief that science provides all of the answers.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a case that doesn't get highlighted as often, and it's abstractly a difficult thing to conceptualize, but it's basically just saying that, much like, and it's something we've been talking about throughout the past weeks, right? When we reviewed existential physics, when we talked about mysticism, when we talked about these different things, is this way of saying, and that's why finding this difficult middle position is hard, is because it's not saying that all science is available for questioning. It's not saying that science is essentially invalid because things change.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not saying that science is this static, concrete thing upon which all of our questions can be answered. It's a living, dynamic thing. It's a thing that is changing. It's a thing that's evolving, but it is a thing. It is a solid substance. And I think that sometimes, which it's highlighted by my anecdotal experience of not coming across the term agnostic in scientific literature, right? Mm-hmm. Because people who are writing these articles, like I mentioned, they are humans. They do have theoretical positions and viewpoints, and they want to interpret data in such a way that supports or rejects certain hypotheses, rather than, begging a school for funding, performing a test, and then saying, well, we don't really know what this is telling us, right? There's a lot of dynamic factors that are happening that cause people to want to avoid the position of saying that they don't know.
The dynamic, I think, is the essential part. And it is hard because you can in all the different ways that in our particular culture, this society in which we are immersed wants to pull toward such and such position, and when you're in that center, it's kind of a Lagrange point.
Yeah, that's a good illustration.
Okay, so which, if it's an unfamiliar term, it's just that place where you can place a satellite or a space station, one hopes, and it's not going to. It's the gravitational equal point between the sun and the earth, or another body in the earth, and I think that's where agnosticism for me lies. I'm agnostic. I've been immersed in an evangelical religious tradition in my life. I've wholly rejected it. I minored in religions and philosophy precisely because of that tremulous, constant pulling back and forth. And so it is possible. I love Grayling's work, but I especially and he'd say, well, grow up, because that's what Grayling often says. But I respectfully say that Huxley had a point, and still does. I don't need there to be a God. If there is, okay, that's interesting. I see no evidence of it. I certainly see no evidence of the things that people who are evangelically inclined seem to find. And I think that's all because it's all on the interior. Mm-hmm. I've had evangelical friends say to me, and I say this, I mean the word friends. You don't have to not have really meaningful relationships with people because one of you is atheistic, one of you is agnostic. It's like a three goes into the bar, and one of you is a Christian or a Muslim. You can still, if you're a grown up and you're fascinated by the universe and you're humble in realizing there's almost nothing that you know, you can have fascinating relationships. But one that I often find the bugaboo, and so this friend and I occasionally poke at each other about this, is that, well, if God wanted, God could stop time entirely. God could reverse time. And I say, well, Doctor Strange can do that. So is that because God liked the Doctor Strange movie? Is that what's going? And you chew at each other and you go, but well, maybe so. But there's no evidence of it. And so, this is where Bertrand Russell was talking at the turn of the 20th century, another major figure who should be read, even though it's all those long days ago. You get into a place, he had a sort of a paradigm, a model, not even a model, an example. If anything is possible, then there could be a teacup out there orbiting Choose Your Planet.
Yeah.
Because if anything's possible, then of course there's a teacup out there orbiting a planet. Well, maybe there is, but we think it probably very much unlikely. But unlikely doesn't mean impossible. So if you say, no, it's not possible, it's just going to be a teacup, then you're probably in the atheist camp. If you say, well, really, statistically not likely, you're still have that open.
Yeah, and that's, what makes the whole thing so difficult is quantum mechanics, right? Because if that never came along, if the whole world could be explained by Newtonian physics, I think that you could take a hard agnostic or atheistic position, right? Because you could say, listen, we can explain everything from beginning to end and everything fits into the theory just fine. And there's really nothing that lends any sort of uncertainty to the empirical observations. But uncertainty, that is agnosticism, is uncertainty. Yeah. And quantum mechanics, this very well described, observed, and even not so much explained, but described and observed phenomenon that has a very legitimate scientific basis, is centered around uncertainty, this inability to know until there's an observation, or the inability to know two pieces of information. You can only know one or the other. And that is the thing that turns science from this solid concrete foundation into something that's more like the smoke monster from Lost, right? It's a solid thing that has a tangible repercussion, but at the same time, it's this nebulous sort of, Well,
thanks for bringing it up. I haven't thought about Lost for a while. My daughter and I
loved it.
I always love that show.
Another show full of philosophers.
Well, yeah.
So that's the difficult part, right? Is that's sort of this area that science inhabits, is not this overarching solid thing that can answer all questions, but something that is most definitely there, most definitely able to describe, explain, but at the same time, there's still inherent uncertainty in the universe that we live in, right?
This brings us to Wittgenstein. We talked about Wittgenstein before. He's one of I'm fascinated by. He didn't write that much that was published, but yet he got us to thinking about language and so on. And this is where I think the agnostic viewpoint can be understood in a slightly different way. He wrote a book in 1969 called On Certainty. and says that we don't acquire most of our beliefs about the world by being persuaded out of skepticism about them. We don't carefully weigh the evidence for every belief proposed to us. Rather, our culture teaches us to organize our experience in certain ways by teaching us concepts, rules of use, names, and language, and we acquire what he calls a picture of the world. So you have a whole network of propositions that are interlinked, and you only start to have, and they support each other in a narrative, and you only start to have doubt about this, of these taken for granted beliefs, if we encounter something that doesn't fit with the picture. So we like to think of ourselves as logical. We're really not. We generally paint stories, and we accept those stories because everything seems to, we find things that are in support of those stories. And only when we run into something that can't be accounted for.
Yeah. And that's why I'm sure that, I don't know how we have any listeners to this podcast, because I'll infuriate everybody, right, in 5 seconds. Because you have, on the one hand, you have stories like that in the Bible, right, where they're fighting a battle and then the sun stands still in the sky while they finish the battle, right? And you go, well, if that were to happen, and all other scientific laws were preserved, you'd have this mass. People would be flying across the face of the earth at 6,000 miles an hour, and there'd be all kinds of crazy things happening.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you look at it and you go, well, based off of our scientific model, the inflation, right? Inflation presents this big problem for the Big Bang Theory and our scientific model, where they go essentially the fine-tuned universe, right? You look at everything that happened in the inflationary epoch between when the Big Bang happened and when the universe, a split second later, a Planck length later, became what it was. And they go, well, did we just make up a number system that fits the observations, or are we actually looking at something that happened? Right? So it's telling a story, right? We don't have the ability to say, it's very difficult.
It is difficult, Joel, and that's why it's worthy of us talking. If anybody listens to us, and I'm grateful that some people listen to us, it can't be that we're not here to provide answers. We're here to provide discursive information and viewpoints that you might not have encountered, and maybe tidbits of knowledge that, Planck length. I'm going to look that up or something. But it's the storytelling that we always do. I'm going to. This is not an advertisement for Marvel, but you know who I am. So, if you think about the whole story of the Thanos movies, and I'm not going to be a spoiler to anybody because this has been years now, right? And it was in the comic books before the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang, and when the universe explodes into being, these stones are created. A stone for reality, a stone for time, a stone for okay. And you look at that and say, yeah, right. But then you say, well, why not? I mean, let's look at the creation story itself. There's a whole lot missing. It's really a broad swath in a few words. And so why should that seem strange? Well, it seems strange because it's out of the general narrative that we often hear. And so it catches our attention. And as Wittgenstein would say, if it catches our attention, maybe we start rethinking a narrative. And if we start rethinking a narrative, then we start asking ourselves questions that might or might not lead toward a belief or toward a skepticism.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, and we mentioned on the show from time to time is that, we're not here to provide answers. We're here to provide an example, right? An example of having philosophical discussions in a way that looks at all of the information and respects opinions and does these things. And then we walk the line very closely sometimes, right? Because I find myself thinking sometimes I don't want to say something that is going to make somebody think that science doesn't exist.
I don't think you've ever said anything.
And I also don't want to say something that would cause somebody, that would offend somebody's religion. But at the same time, I think that the point is that it should cause you to rethink how you interact with those constructs, science and religion, right?
Yes.
There's going to be things about religion that are objectively unscientific. But there's going to be things about science that, depending on what kind of person you are, you're going to outrightly accept or outrightly reject, when you shouldn't do that. You should look closer into how something was done or the theoretical stances somebody had. And if you don't have the tools to do that, then you should find institutions that relay that information that are trustworthy, right? Yeah. And if that's what philosophy is. And if you follow that process, what you're going to find is that you are almost necessarily agnostic.
Yeah, and you may well be aligned with many different positions, some of which are mutually exclusive, and so you start to. It's a lifelong process. Philosophy is a lifelong learning process. It's what Socrates was teaching us. It's what Sabine Hassenfelder teaches us. It's what Ferenczi Gossetti was teaching us. It's still. It's not about being mushy and, oh, well, this is true and that's true and everything's true. It's not about this ridiculous relativism. And it's not about saying, well, we don't know anything. Well, because we know a few things. And I think that we try not to be offensive as a first principle, but I'm not particularly worried about offending if by offending one has said something that makes people back off and think.
Yeah, no. I don't think that it's offending people so much that I'm worried about as reinforcing or establishing beliefs, right?
Yes.
And I would hope that anybody listening to the show is enough of an independent thinker that they can think about these things for themselves, rather than hearing what you and I are saying and taking our position for at its face value, right? But so this raises, so we're looking at Grayling and Dawkins, right? These guys that are saying that essentially that agnosticism is a weak position and that atheism should just be embraced. So is agnosticism merely a position based on probabilities, right? Basically saying that, I'm not going to put a number on it, but there's a % chance that there's a God or there isn't a God, and I'm on here somewhere.
I guess if one looks at it from Pascal or the implication is there. When I was a kid, I first encountered Blaise Pascal. I thought, this makes all right, but that's also based, but also tips toward the scales of things that I think personally, as one person, we ought to know better by. If your religion, if you're religious, if you're theistic, if your beliefs are located in a place of fear and reward, have at it. Go have a good life. I can't abide or embrace that. It's okay. I don't hate you for it. I want you to live and have the kind of life that you want to have, but it makes no sense to me. So not strictly, not a gambling sense of numbers and statistics, but yeah, I think that. Here's Grayling on this. I think this will be helpful since we're talking about numbers.
Okay.
Grayling says the initial probability of there being a deity is not 50%, as some try to argue. There is a hidden assumption of agnosticism, which premises the thought that there is insufficient evidence to settle the matter either way. One can see this by asking what initial probability should be attached to the existence of, say, dryads or unicorns or anything whose presence in myth, fable, legend, and religion derives from what our remote ancestors handed down and stories from their world. Whatever the probability is, if it is not zero, then it is vanishing close to zero. And though it indeed seem odd even to say the probability that unicorns exist is vanishingly small. The mistake made by many is to think that because a particular tradition has been institutionalized in society, it increases the probability that the things it talks about actually exist. So if you say agnosticism has that vanishingly small possibility, I think clearly he even has to acknowledge that. But if you take it as, well, that vanishingly small possibility leads to a higher and higher percentage somehow because of institutions, then you're not doing the math.
Yeah. Yeah, this is interesting. We're back to Russell's teapot, right?
Yeah,
which is this idea that
or the Infinity Stones.
right, exactly. So, yeah, it gets real interesting because, again, some of these hard agnostic or atheistic positions, essentially, a lot of these guys the atheists are arguing, listen, like, if you're just going to take a soft agnostic position, but you're going to say that there's a 1% chance, so I can't say, just come over to our side. What are you doing? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, just, but on the other hand, right? So, and this is, again, the easiest place to do it is metaphysics, right? To go back and look at the origins of the universe and talk about how in conceptualizing frameworks for how the Big Bang comes about, especially in quantum mechanics, there's this idea that if you give an infinitely long amount of time, you will have an infinitely large amount of things that can happen. So there are some positions that say, well, technically a teapot could pop into existence in orbit around a planet the same way that a universe could pop into existence based off of the interaction of different brains and waves in the pre-universe. So again, we're back to that story, right? This idea of, oh, okay, well, it's real easy to pick on religion because there's so many things that just don't add up. But at the same time, there are things not about science, but about pre-scientific, aka philosophical, theoretical positions that are held by people at the top of science. And the question, I think, there is, well, should we believe these people, right? These people are undoubtedly very knowledgeable. They're at the top of their field. So if Stephen Hawking tells me God is dead, God doesn't exist, does he have more insight into the issue than I do based off of his knowledge of physics? Or really is he just as in the dark as I am because there's no way, there's hard agnostic, we're in a necessarily hard agnostic position about what happened before the universe or where the universe came from, right? It's just, it's really difficult. So this idea that agnosticism is a position based on probabilities, I think that, well, if you put a % chance on it, maybe that's going to determine whether or not you're a hard or soft agnostic.
And vanishingly small, it's still possible. So it's not like, I think this is where, for one of the things I wanted to say today is I think that if people hear this conversation and maybe think, it takes some people would say it takes some effort to be a good person within any religious system. Well, that implies a dynamic involvement that isn't just static and accepting. Okay? But it also takes some reasonable intellectual effort to say, I'm in this Lagrange point. I've propelled myself or been propelled by gravitational forces of various kinds to be here. I'm not going over there right now because it doesn't make any sense to me, but it certainly doesn't make any sense to me to be over here either. But I got a fine view of the universe.
Yeah. No, I think that
dangling here in space.
I think that there's a reason that people have a hard time saying, I don't know, like I talked about in the intro, especially when it's in regards, it doesn't surprise me that the term agnosticism has become subsumed into religious talk as opposed to being used universally. Because I think that that's the hardest place to be agnostic, right? Because I think that it's easy to go along with stories that you're being told on one side or the other. But I think that to say that you don't know about an issue that big it should be necessarily a little frightening, right? To say that you don't know, right?
Carl Sagan was dying of cancer, and one of the things he wrote is, the world is so exquisite with so much love and moral depth that there is no reason to deceive ourselves with pretty stories for which there's little good evidence. Notice he said little. Far better, it seems to me, in our vulnerability is to look death in the eye and to be grateful every day for the brief but magnificent opportunity that life provides. There's sort of a homily in that. In that we don't know if anything happens next. And if it does, wow, adventure. Not if it does, well, was I good and therefore I get to be an eternal joy or bad, and I'm punished for the rest of time for a few years of life. I don't. That's where I think for people like Sagan and who write, who are scientists who are writing for lay people, who are saying, let's not miss everything that's in front of us. Let's take everything that's in front of us and then figure out what we make with it.
Yeah. Yeah. My class, one of the things that we looked at was Peter Fenwick's work on near-death experiences, right? Which here was a guy who was a very well-regarded neuropsychologist and a neurologist who decided to look into near-death experiences, which at the time was not great for your career. Mm-hmm. It was kind of frowned upon. And he did a lot of studies looking at these cases and came up with sort of a framework of how they take place, and came to some interesting conclusions. If you want to look him up on your own, Peter Fenwick was his name. But yeah, this I don't think that accepting one position or the other, right? Saying that, okay, well, there's nothing out there, and I'm just going to die and that's it, or well, God created me and I'm going to heaven or hell. I don't think that having either one of those positions is necessary to live a meaningful life.
Yeah.
Which is something that we've talked about in the past. Yes. This very idea of having a meaningful life and, where meaning comes from. But yeah, it's very interesting. Do you want to talk about what separates agnosticism from ignosticism?
Sure, let's go there. You start.
So I thought this was kind of interesting because this is...
I got my notes. I'm going to take it out.
Yeah, this is a position. So we've talked about agnosticism so far, which sort of says that there's these established positions around, and you're saying that you don't know, so you're not going to commit to one of these positions. Ignosticism is this idea that you have to put forward a coherent conception of what your worldview is before a position can be taken. So if you were to tell me this story, whether it's religious or rational or whatever it is, if I'm able to poke holes in it, then there's really no point in me giving any credence to it, right?
Right. Agnosticism is it's a fun word. It's just a fun word. What? Your brain crank, and it's to say it's meaningless to talk about God, because conceptually there is no unambiguous definition that contributes to any coherent conversation. So if you, let's see, what's theological institutions argue with each other about God, and some try to the Catholic, the Christian, Muslim, Allah, okay, different names. Are they all the same being? Or if they're not the same being, what's going on? And if they are the same being, what is Well, we can't define God because God is everything, or God is love, or God is omnipotence, or God is the sum totality of all things. And okay, and what does that mean?
Right.
That's what agnosticism asks.
Yeah, which is really interesting, because you see, even the major religions take different positions on that, right? Like, if from a Christian religion viewpoint, Muslims are essentially bad. Islam is bad, right? But in the Islamic religion, there's still elements of the Christian story that work their way into it. Jesus is a prophet.
Religions come from the same source.
Right.
Right. So they better acknowledge some, but don't necessarily always do that. So I think it's a good party game, but much more seriously, it's a good discursive topic. Tell somebody to define God. Ask somebody to define God.
Yeah.
The illusion of explanatory depth works with this too.
Yes, exactly. Because there are things, and there's been philosophers that have looked at this in the past and have said, okay, well, if you're saying that God is everywhere, right? Well, that's impossible. Like, that doesn't add up,
And if so, what does that mean? Is God watching everything? God not doing anything? Is God manipulating things? Is God a manipulator? Is God I'll just do this? Does God send cyclones to punish cities, as some politicians want to say? I don't think so. It makes no sense. Or God is both male and female. Whoa, you can believe that, but you can still assert things about human beings' conditions, and whether your condition is better than somebody else's. How dare you? It's, just the definition can ignite thought. Doesn't have to ignite violence, but can ignite some pretty humbling thought about why are we doing the things we do if you really believe this.
Yeah. I think that is, it's kind of a cool, it's a cool thought experiment, right? Because if you take the concept of God just for granted, right? Because think about that. How many religious texts go into fine detail about the definition of deity? Not many do. It's usually just, hey, God was here at the beginning and he did this stuff.
Unless you go into the Gnostic texts.
Right. So definition by attribution is not necessarily accurate, right? If you know me just based off of all the things that I've done, but you don't actually know anything about me, that's a very incomplete form of knowledge. So yeah, this idea, agnosticism, right? This looking at it and saying, okay, well, if we can't even conceptualize what this thing is, then what's the point of talking about it? It's kind of...
And this is where it bridges with agnosticism, because Huxley and folks were talking about, well, okay, then you can't really talk about having a personal relationship with a being who is everywhere and all. How do you have a personal relationship with something that is not a person?
Yeah.
And that's not mocking again. It's just a rational question. But it needs to be addressed.
Yeah. So there's a whole lot of topics surrounding agnosticism that are really cool. And of course, agnosticism is one of them. And there's probabilisticism, I think, and there's a whole bunch of them that are kind of interesting positions. But let's wrap it up by asking: is true agnosticism mystical?
I'm not going to the very fact of calling it true. I'm not falling for that. You can lead me right up to that minefield. I think I know what you intend, but what do you mean by true?
I think the true agnosticism is as simple as saying, I don't know, and meaning it.
Yes. I think that's accurate agnosticism. Truth implies a knowledge in itself that I don't know that we have. But to say, basically saying I don't know, that's accurate.
So do you think that if if you really don't know, do you think that is, do you think that can be a mystical experience based off of our conversation that we had in prior weeks?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I think this is what poetry is about.
I think so too. I think that it's almost, I think it's easier. I think it's almost more mystical if you don't know. It's proposed the other way in a lot of cases, especially Gnosticism, right? Gnosticism is sort of predicated on this idea of the mystical experience because of a relationship with a religious or a deity of some kind. But it almost seems like, regardless of what end you're on, whether it's religious or scientific, if you have a narrative in place, if you have a story in place, it seems to me like it would be much more difficult to have an experience that you could identify as mystical.
For me, agnosticism is, there's a lovely word, it's a word that I very much enjoy. The word is liminal. Liminal means living at the boundary or the edge of, or on both sides of the boundary of something that may be close to mystical for a moment, which is why I say poetry, because we have intuitive recognitions in poetry or art, or all kinds of singing, whatever, music, that we can't necessarily always vocalize. There's that liminal place. And there's a word that I also enjoy, it's numinous. But numinous is an adjective. A numinous experience would be having what one would think was a strongly spiritual experience that pointed toward a deity. The liminal is not theistically based. The numinous is. And for me, the agnostic position is more liminal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, because I think that brings us back to this idea of where is the center point, right? Which is why you laughed at the idea of true agnosticism, right?
Yeah, mock me.
Because
okay.
Saying true implies knowledge, but I think that implying that you know where the middle point of agnosticism is very difficult. Is the center in soft agnosticism? Is the center in hard agnosticism? Is true agnosticism liminal? Or is it numinous, being open to the idea that it's funny because you have these experiences. I don't know that everybody does. But I know that I do. And I would like to think that everybody does.
Mm-hmm.
Where yesterday, right, I'm taking a walk in the snow. There's nobody around. It's very quiet. The snow's dampening everything. And you just go, like, where did all this come from? Like, is everything just show up out of nowhere? Or am I part of an alien simulation? And that's liminal and numinous, right? This is the idea that, well, I don't know either way. I'm agnostic about the knowledge of it. But how am I interpreting the experience that I'm having? This subliminal or liminal experience of being overwhelmed by the vastness and the complete just,
That's the sublimes that we've talked about before. Being overwhelmed with the vastness, being moved by the extreme beauty or terror, but being moved.
And that might be the difference, right? Between a liminal and a numinous experience is the beauty or the awe versus the terror. It might be in there somewhere, depending on what your views are.
It might be. I can't imagine any sane human being not being in utter terror of encountering something that is an omniscient, omnipresent being.
Yeah.
That doesn't imply an endorsement of, oh well, so we better be good because Santa Claus is watching. It's that otherness, capital O, is very present in that. But there's also sublime, liminal into sublime, or liminal into numinous, which goes different directions, sometimes the same direction. of seeing something so big that you know that it could instantly eradicate. When people would describe on voyages when they're first going north and describe the mountains of ice, which take nothing at all to just crack a ship and leave it. That's a sublime experience. Which is why the capital R romantic time period of the creation of the Frankenstein story, all of that comes out of.
Yeah. So it takes us to all kinds of cool places, right? This idea of agnosticism. Part of the thing I wanted to talk about the probabilities was just what you mentioned, right? We talked about Russell's teapot. We also, one of the things the atheists say is, well, if you're going to say there's just the smallest chance God might exist, so I can't say that he doesn't, well, you might as well say the same thing about Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, right? Well, I think that's a little bit disingenuous, right? Because you could, scientifically, you can say, okay, well, you could perform experiments, you could perform observations and say, okay, well, we see parents putting money on their kids' pillows and taking teeth. But we can't observe whether there's a teapot orbiting a planet because it's too far away. So can we apply the same principles to this, to the other, despite the fact that the observation and that the explanation of the phenomena isn't there?
Yeah, I think it's more that we tell the stories that we think children need to have to make life somehow richer or somehow more meaningful. Or this is what Sagan was talking about. Why do we tell stories about little green men and flying saucers, which he always said if anybody ever showed him, he thought it was probable that there was life on other places, but it hasn't been here because you can't show evidence that it's been here. But he would be convinced. Well, why do we work so hard to put the idea of mystical, magical, sublime, esoteric, Gnostic something into a child's life unless we think that it's important that we have that? And so why can't we look up at the sky with a child and not make up any stories about anything and just say, feel that?
Yeah.
But instead we go around all these other things because otherwise life is just too terrible without all the stories. And that takes us back to Wittgenstein again.
Yeah. Yeah. And then this has me revved up about storytelling. I want to do another episode. I think that we did one once.
We can go back to it.
Yeah, we should. All right. Until next time, keep pondering.